The International Methods Colloquium is a periodic online interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Rice University and the National Science Foundation. This week's speaker is Molly Roberts of the University of California, San Diego. Her talk is entitled Detecting and Understanding Propaganda in Chinese Newspapers. Molly's talk is going to last between 30 and 40 minutes, after which point we'll take questions from the audience. You may call in a question on the air at our toll-free call-in line, 1-855-667-8287. That's 1-855-NO-STATS. You can also email questions to the methods.colloquium@gmail.com. All of this will be displayed in your chat section. Finally, you can ask a question using the GoToWebinar Ask Question box that appears in the GoToWebinar control panel. For our viewers outside the United States, we recommend using the Ask Question box to ensure that we receive your questions immediately. A copy of the slideshow that goes along with this presentation is available at the link shown under my webcam, which I don't have turned on, but it'll be posted on the chat line. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Molly to the IMC. Take it away, Molly.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Molly. I'm from the University of California, San Diego. I'm going to be talking today about propaganda in China and detecting and understanding propaganda in Chinese newspapers. This is joint work with Brandon Stewart, who's at Harvard University, but will soon be joining Princeton University. So I'm going to start today with a little bit of a story. So these anchors are on the Chinese television show Xinwen Lianbo. And this Chinese television nightly news program airs every single night in China, and it airs on a lot of different news channels. It airs across the entire country. It's one of the most watched news programs in the world. Shown simultaneously across the whole country, and the interesting thing about it is it's clearly government propaganda. It's well known. People know that this is the voice of the government, and that it's typically known as propaganda. So because it's clearly propaganda, a lot of Chinese internet users and other types of people around the world sort of make fun of it a lot. So you'll see things on Weibo talking about Xinwen Lianbo. Weibo is the Chinese Twitter. And you'll see things like Xinwen Lianbo is decades of telling lies and empty stories people don't want to hear. Another example is what they do is simply sit there and talk from a pre-censored script. Some people have summed up Xinwen Lianbo with this summary. The first 10 minutes, the people on the news program say that the leaders are always busy. The second 10 minutes, they say that the people are perfectly happy. And the final 10 minutes, they say that the world outside of China is extremely chaotic. So it seems like that many people on the internet and many people in China realize that this is Chinese propaganda and make fun of it online. And you'll also see this if you do a Google image search of Xinwen Lianbo. You get lots of different pictures sort of making fun of the newscasters. So what's really interesting about this, this phenomenon in China is that while propaganda is still very much alive in China, it's also very recognizable. So propaganda, the way that I'm going to define it in this presentation, is the state-mandated dissemination of information. The Central Propaganda Department in China is extensive and powerful, and it's still very active in China. The purpose is to educate and to shape society. Basically, what the propaganda department does is it issues directives of what to print in different types of media, newspapers, newsletters, etc. And it also issues directives of what not to print. But the puzzle for political scientists is, isn't propaganda in China irrelevant? Given that we can notice it, there are a lot of people sort of poke fun at it, isn't it sort of outdated? And people have asked, isn't propaganda sort of out of touch with Chinese society today? The prevalence of other perspectives, the prevalence of foreign media, of online media, of newspapers that are commercialized in China, doesn't this make it sort of difficult to persuade people about propaganda? And some people have puzzled over, won't citizens just resist propaganda when they notice it? Won't they just, notice it and then decide that that's not the perspective that they want to take? So a question that a few scholars have tried to tackle recently is, why does propaganda still exist in China? So there's sort of two different theories within the literature right now about why propaganda exists in China. The first is the indoctrination theory of propaganda. This theory states that despite being outmoded, people still believe in propaganda. And there's some evidence that citizens in China support propaganda. There's evidence that people like state-guided opinion. They look to the state to guide their opinion. There's some evidence outside of China that propaganda can create an emotional connection between citizens and government, even if citizens aren't necessarily persuaded intellectually to the propaganda. And there's a few papers that note that maybe some people may not be sophisticated enough to resist propaganda. So perhaps there's some people that notice that propaganda notice propaganda in China, but some people may not notice it and may actually be persuaded by it. So this indoctrination theory of propaganda has several observable implications of what propaganda should be. So indoctrination propaganda should be prominently displayed. If people are persuaded by propaganda, you want it to be in front and center so that they can be persuaded. Should be persuasive. We would expect in this case that propaganda would be argumentative, would be trying to persuade people. And we would expect in the indoctrination theory of propaganda that propaganda would be noticeable. It doesn't matter if people notice that propaganda is occurring, that they would actually be persuaded or look to it to guide their opinion. So the second theory of propaganda is in a recent paper Haifeng Huang from UC Merced has about that perhaps that propaganda is not a persuasion mechanism, but more of a signal of party strength. So the idea behind this is that propaganda may distinguish weak states from strong states, and the fact that the state can force propaganda itself indicates that they're still in control. So Huang does an experiment where he assigns people propaganda, and what he finds is that people are not persuaded by propaganda, but they think that the party is more stable after viewing it. So they think that the party is stronger after viewing propaganda, even if they're not actually persuaded by it. And so the observable implication of signaling propaganda is that it should also be very prominently displayed. It should be front and center. It doesn't necessarily have to be persuasive, but it has to be noticeable, that people should be able to notice that propaganda is going on and therefore internalize that there's some signal of party strength. So in this talk, what we're going to do is actually measure propaganda. So both of these theories sort of imply what propaganda should look like, but identifying exactly what propaganda is in Chinese media is actually really hard today, and I'll explain why later. So in this talk, we're going to measure propaganda in Chinese newspapers. We're going to find that propaganda isn't always what we think it is. It's not always noticeable or recognizable. It covers a range of issues, not just political ideology. And it suggests an additional logic on top of these other two theories for propaganda. We're going to argue that propaganda may be used sometimes to de-emphasize news stories. It may be used as a means of control, not always of persuasion. And in some cases, it can be used to block or distract. It can be used to sort of de-emphasize other news stories by promoting propaganda. So what we're going to argue is that sometimes the content of propaganda, the persuasiveness or signaling of propaganda, is not as important as its shadow, as what would have happened had the propaganda not been mandated by the state. So the outline of this presentation is I'm going to go over a little bit of background of propaganda in China. I'm going to talk about exactly how we measure propaganda in Chinese newspapers. I'm going to talk about propaganda as a means of control. And then I'm going to give some implications of the study of media control. So propaganda has a long history in China, but it was particularly strongly developed during the Maoist era. Mao developed a lot of propaganda. Propaganda was high on his priority list. And his idea was that propaganda was going to win over the petty bourgeois with persuasive reasoning. And people have described propaganda during the Maoist era in a lot of different ways, but some people have described it as brainwashing, some people have described it as more of like mass persuasion. But the idea was there were mass ideological campaigns that everyone in the country participated in. There was inclusion of thought work into everyday activities, into work, into home life, into work life. And there was no commercialized media during this time, so propaganda was very easily identifiable. There's no sort of alternative source of media besides media coming from the state, so we knew that all media was propaganda in some sense. no access to outside media either, so their propaganda wasn't actually competing with any sort of outside source. So today it looks really, propaganda in China looks really different. It's still a central force. We still have a central propaganda department that oversees radio, newspapers, television, and the internet. The propaganda department still issues directives to print specific media material to the media. Slogans and political education are still employed. There are even propaganda paid 50-cent party members who are propaganda internet members who are paid to disseminate information on the web. So there's even a web component to propaganda. However, with market forces, there's also been access to foreign media, and there's also been the commercialization of Chinese newspapers. So newspapers in China don't get all of their funding from the state. Actually, a lot of it now they get from the market. And so there's this conflict within newspapers in particular between the state and the market. The state often wants positive news about what's been going on in China, but what we know from news media and from the market for news media is often the market wants negative news. So there's often a conflict between what the state wants and what the market wants, and there's a sort of tension within newspapers because of this. So because of this sort of new media and commercialization of newspapers, propaganda is obfuscated. So before media was completely government-run, propaganda and censorship were very easy to measure. And in some sense, scholars still assume that they know what propaganda is in China and that they can identify it when they see it. But can they, is one of the questions we kind of want to ask in this talk. Newspapers in China get a lot of compensation from the market itself. So we can't really, so it's sort of, propaganda is obscured by this commercialization. We don't know what news is driven by the state within a newspaper versus what news is actually driven by the market. If we have a newspaper article within a newspaper, we can't tell whether this article was printed because of a directive by the state or printed because the editors thought that this would be a particularly popular article among its audience. And this makes it difficult to study the strategy of political education and propaganda within China. Okay, so we're going to measure propaganda in China. And the idea behind our measurement of propaganda is that the propaganda department itself issues directives to newspapers. So some of these directives are censorship directives, saying don't print certain stories. And some of these directives are propaganda directives, saying you must print certain stories. So here's a leak directive that we came across. This is a propaganda directive, so it's a you must print directive. And this directive states, the State Council recently endorsed several points on deepening income distribution reform. All media are to cover this according to the Xinhua Wire copy. So this is a pretty typical propaganda directive from the central government to the newspapers, because it's telling the media to cover the story according to Xinhua, which is the central Chinese government newspaper. So a lot of times the propaganda directives will say, please cover this story according to the Xinhua copy. So the implication of these directives is that if we see lots of newspapers with exactly the same article or very, very similar articles, we can say this is probably or more likely propaganda. But in order to do this, and so what we're going to do is we're going to look for articles that occur across lots and lots of different newspapers. So in order to do this, we have to gather a lot of newspapers. So to see the big picture, we need sort of big data. So what we've been doing over the past several years is collecting provincial and city-level newspapers in China. We have, as of now, we have about 31 papers. We have 7 years of coverage. We have 3.9 million articles. Actually, I think at this point we now have 5 million articles. We're just collecting and collecting more. This encapsulates about 1 billion different words and counting. We're still collecting all of this data. And this comes with some very non-trivial logistical challenges because these data are really big, and we've had to develop some new databasing methods in order to search them and to identify people in them and to do lots of different, identify all the metadata about them. Today, I'm going to focus on 25 of these papers within the years of 2012 and 2013. So these years we have a particularly large number of papers, so we'll be able to identify propaganda because we have a lot of papers. We can see if they're all printing the same thing. These are both provincial and city-level newspapers, so they're all sort of local newspapers. So what we're going to do is we're going to estimate coordination among these newspapers by estimating the topics for each article. We're going to estimate a topical vector for every single article within our corpus. This topical vector is going to be a vector which has the proportion of each article in each of k topics. In this case, we're going to have 300 topics. So we're going to estimate for every newspaper article that we have, we're going to estimate how much of that article falls into each of k topics. Then we're going to compare these topic vectors within each day that we have to estimate coordination. We're going to use measures of similarity, cosine similarity, and Hellinger distance between the topical vectors to find articles that are extremely similar and were also printed on the same day. We're going to use these high similarity measures as indication of coordination across newspapers. So some people have asked, well, why don't you use another method of plagiarism detection? So this is a comparison of topical vectors we could think of as a measure of plagiarism detection, right? We could think of as a measure of very, very similar documents. And one of the reasons is that because we're estimating topics on all of these different documents, the estimating topics themselves allows us to do a lot of back-end interpretation on propaganda. So the fact that we're actually using the topics to estimate coordination also means we can interpret what the newspaper articles were about after we measure that coordination. Okay, so the first step in this is actually estimating the topics, and to do this we use a method that we developed called the structural topic model. So the structural topic model is basically a topic model, but it also includes covariates on the document. So in this case, for each of the documents, we have the day on which it was published, and we have the newspaper from which it came. So the structural topic model has a hierarchical structure of topics. So the idea is that we have words that are nested within documents. We also have each document is nested within a newspaper or it's nested within a day. And because we include both the information about the words and the information about the covariates, the newspaper and time, we can better retrieve topics and topic covariate relationships than like a regular sort of what we call a vanilla topic model like LDA. So we're including additional information into the topic model to better estimate the topics. So basically the idea behind the structural topic model is it's the latent Dirichlet allocation, which is our vanilla topic model, plus contextual information. So STM is extending this vanilla topic model, this LDA, by including covariates. So we're extending it by saying that each topic is a distribution over words. That's the same as LDA. Each document is a distribution over topics. Each document has a distribution, some proportion of all of the different topics. And we're going to learn rather than assume topics from the text. So just like LDA, we're going to learn the topics. It's an unsupervised method. We're going to learn topics from the text. And topics are going to be words that frequently co-occur. So we're going to find topics based on the fact that they frequently co-occur within documents. So STM is going to provide two different ways to include contextual information into this latent Dirichlet allocation model. The first is we're going to allow topical prevalence to vary by metadata. So we're going to allow the amount that a topic is talked about within one document to vary by both what newspaper it's in and time. And where, for example, like city papers cover pollution more than provincial papers, we might be able to estimate that. And we're also going to allow topical content to vary by metadata. So for example, individuals, newspapers might talk about pollution or any type of topic differently than another. And this is particularly important in our context because we have topics that all newspapers talk about, but they all use different city names because they're all in different locations to talk about the same topic. So the newspapers are going to talk about, if they all talk about pollution, they're all going to talk about pollution, but they're going to talk about it in the context of their city. So that allows us to control for the fact that each newspaper is going to talk about it one topic slightly differently. So including this type of context is going to improve the model because it's going to allow more accurate estimation, which is what we've shown in other work, and better qualitative interpretability. So we're going to better be able to interpret the topics because we've included this covariate information. So the innovation for this paper is that it's really hard to estimate the STM with a whole bunch of documents. Like we have in this application. So typically STM is estimated with a method called variational inference. And the variational inference is sort of a variant of the expectation maximization algorithm. And in this case, what we're doing is when we do the optimization, we first iterate through each document, so each newspaper article in this case, and we estimate parameters that are on the document specifically. So in this case, it's the document topic proportion. It's that topical vector I was talking about earlier. So for each document, we're going to estimate the topical vector. We're going to do that. We're going to iterate through the entire corpus and estimate the topical vector. And then after we've done that for all of the documents, we estimate the topic words for the entire corpus. So we estimate what the topics are in the entire corpus. And then we go back to the documents and we do it again, and we go back to the topics, and we iterate until we converge. So that's the idea behind the variational inference that we do in the STM. This is really fast. We've implemented this in an R package, but it's not very fast when you do it on millions of documents because you have to iterate through each single document in that first step. So we develop, we adapt a method from the computer science literature called stochastic variational inference, and we optimize it for the structural topic model in order to estimate the topics on each of our documents. So the idea behind stochastic variational inference is for each iteration, instead of iterating over all of the documents, we take a random sample of about 5,000 documents in this case. We estimate the topic proportions for each of those 5,000 documents. Then, so that's just estimating topic proportions for each of these 5,000 documents. Then we go and estimate global topics based on those 5,000 documents. And then we take another sample of 5,000 documents, a different sample. We estimate topic proportions for each of those documents, and we mix the global topics from the last step with the topics from this from the current step. So there's a mixing between what we have currently from our current sample of 5,000 documents and what we have from the last beta that the last topic matrix that we've estimated. And we go back and forth and we repeat this with different samples, and we mix with smaller proportions each time. So each time we do this, the new topic matrix that we estimate, the new global topics that we estimate, we put a smaller weight on because the old topic matrix that we estimate is the combination of many, many more steps. So the procedure takes about 8 minutes per iteration and converges within about 200 iterations. So it's pretty fast. If you were going to do this with a regular STM, it would take a very, very, very long time to estimate. In this case, it converges quite quickly. And what we have is then that topical vector for each of those individual documents in our corpus. So we have a 300 a vector with a length of 300 that has topical estimates for each document. So one of the interesting things about this application is that synchronized articles are not actually perfect reprints of each other. So in this case, these are two different articles that are coordinated from two different newspapers. They're printed on the same day. And what you'll see is that they actually, even if you can't read Chinese, you'll see that they actually don't look very much alike. So you see that the title is actually different, okay? The paragraphs look very different, right? The space in between the paragraphs look very different. This is because each of the articles actually has a slightly different preamble. And they also, even though a lot of the text is exactly the same, they've separated it just slightly differently for each of those. And one of the articles actually skips large portions of the article of the original Xinhua article, where the other, cuts and pastes different types of it. So because of this, the cosine similarity and Hellinger distance between the topical vectors actually works really well, because the similarity in topic, the very, very similarity in topic is what we're getting at, not exact reprints of the words. And what we find is that documents that have high cosine similarity and high Hellinger distance between the topical vectors, that actually picks up really well different articles that are coordinated. And we validate this with a whole bunch of samples of different pairs of documents, and we find that it's a pretty good measure of pairs of documents that we know are coordinated. So the output of this is we have clusters of coordinated articles for each individual day that we're interested in. So we have each individual day, we have like a propaganda cluster. So the difficult part of this application is that we have to figure out how many newspapers have to be coordinated in order for it to actually count as a directive. So we know that the central newspaper, Xinhua, also syndicates content. So it's also kind of like AP, where smaller newspapers will sort of pick up news from Xinhua because they don't want to create their own article; they just want to reprint. So one of the big challenges of this paper is how do we distinguish between elective reprinting because you're syndicating content, and mandated reprinting an article from Xinhua because you've been directed to reprint it. So the general rule that we're going to use is that the more newspapers that reprint the article, the more likely it is that it's mandated. And what you see with syndicated content is that it's very unlikely that a lot of newspapers, or the majority of newspapers, are actually going to syndicate exactly the same article. Typically, it will be a handful of newspapers that syndicate articles, and we'll show this to you in a second. So we have two strategies for checking. The first strategy is we used a leak directive, and we see how many of the newspapers actually followed the leak directive. And we also use placebo topics. So we use topics that we don't think there would be a propaganda directive on, and we see how many newspapers typically syndicate content at once from those placebo topics. So this is that leak directive that I showed you earlier. This is the full text of that leak directive, at least the text that we have. So this was the one that said the State Council recently endorsed several points on deepening income distribution reform. All media are to cover this according to the Xinhua wire copy. Do not change headlines, put the story on the front page, or lure readers to it. Except for the wire copy, do not produce any other form of report, commentary, or link. Do not post it on the media's official Weibo account. Okay, so there's a lot more instructions besides just print this story. It's also where to print it. It's also what headline to use, etc. And we find that in our data, 22 out of the 25 newspapers followed the directive. So it's not that directives mean that every single newspaper follows it. Some newspapers do defect, but the vast majority of them follow it if the directive is issued. We found in our data that none of the newspapers put it on the front page, so they all followed the directive not to put it on the front page. And we found that 7 out of the 22 newspapers actually did change the title, which is interesting, and we'll get back to this. So 7 out of the 22 newspapers did change the headline. So if we look at placebo topics, we chose 2 placebo topics. We found sports and we found weather. And we decided that these are probably less likely than other topics to have a propaganda directive on. So these are 2 histograms of the number of papers coordinated for each type of coordination cluster in both sports and in weather. And you see that in both of these, the vast majority of coordinated content only has like 2 or 3 newspapers that are coordinated at the same time. And this is probably what's happening when there's syndication of content. That the sports or in sports or in weather, there are a couple newspapers that are just picking up articles from Xinhua. We find that in weather, the max number of newspapers that coordinate is 7, versus in sports, it's unlikely for newspapers to syndicate or to have a coordinated content after 10. We have 1 event at 20, but that we think might have actually been a directive because it was associated with the Olympic steroids case with a Chinese athlete. So this very, very last one might be a propaganda directive, but the rest of them we think probably are syndicated content. So we decided that the propaganda cutoff here is probably somewhere between 10 to 15 papers. We're trying to make this more accurate with different types of methods, but we think that 22 papers follow the leak directive. Most of the types of topics we think are syndicating content are cut off under 10. So we choose 15 in this paper. This talk is a hard cutoff, but we are trying to explore ways to make this more accurate, and we'd be happy to hear your suggestions about making this more accurate. All right, so what did we find? So the prior literature describes propaganda as symbolic, persuasive, ideological, associated with political education, heavily advertised, attracting attention, easily identified by the reader. In contrast, I'm going to show you that propaganda covers a wide range of issues. It often masquerades as a news story. It mostly occurs on the back pages, except in sensitive time periods, which will show that propaganda is ideological and moves to the front pages. So we're going to argue that propaganda can control the news cycle by crowding out other stories. So sometimes it moves to the front pages and crowds out other stories. It can manipulate readers by affecting the ease of consumption. So when propaganda is mandated on the back pages, it's harder to find. It's harder to find those types of stories. And propaganda in this case is somehow converging with censorship, right? Propaganda in this case is not necessarily using to persuade or to be symbolic, but it can also be a form of control, a form of controlling the dissemination of information. So here are the number of coordinated events within a whole bunch of different topic areas. So these are the topic areas that have the most coordinated events with over 15 newspapers coordinated. So these events we all think are coming from propaganda directives. So the most prevalent topic that's coordinated is party history and slogans. So this is kind of what we would expect with the propaganda topic. But what's interesting is that a lot of these other topics don't really have to do with ideology or political education. So for example, we have diplomatic meetings, which are often highly coordinated across newspapers. We have prison sentences, which is something we might not expect, but is highly coordinated across newspapers. We have U.S. foreign policy, we have aviation and space, and we have corruption. So we have some things that don't necessarily reflect very well on the party that are highly coordinated across newspapers. So let's take a quick look at the prison topic. So these are some of the events that are coordinated within the prison topic. And you'll see that because our content is between 2012 and 2013, these are all associated with the downfall of Bo Xilai, who was a very prominent party member. He was the mayor of Chongqing, and he was taken out of the party, removed from the party in March of 2012. And these, the Gu Kailai trial, the Wang Lijun trial, and the Bo Xilai trial, all of those prison events, these coordinated events, are associated with Bo Xilai. Gu Kailai is Bo Xilai's wife. Wang Lijun was Bo Xilai's chief of police. The other two are very high-level corruption cases within the party. And we see that these are highly coordinated across newspapers, even though they're not, we wouldn't necessarily think of them as propaganda. We also see that the foreign policy topic, there are a lot of different events that are coordinated. This includes like Russian opinions on the South China Sea, Japan and the Diaoyu Islands, which are very controversial in China, a British leader meeting with the Dalai Lama, which isn't necessarily something that the CCP would want to advertise, a U.S.-Japan security agreement with respect to the Diaoyu Islands. So these are all very sensitive foreign policy events in China. What's interesting is that these propaganda events that occur on sensitive topics often all occur on the back pages. So this histogram on the x-axis is the percentage of the coordinated cluster that occurs on the front page. All right? So 0 means that all of the newspapers in the coordinated cluster put that article on the back page. And we see there's this big spike at 0. It seems like there's a lot of directives that indicate that the article itself should be put on the back page. And this is interesting because a lot of these sensitive events are very of interest to the Chinese population, so you might think that if this directive actually didn't hold, that they would actually move to the front page. So for example, none of the articles on the Diaoyu Island topic occur on the front page. They all occur on the back page. Less than 10% of foreign policy, rule of law, or prison topics, which are all sensitive coordinated topics, occur on the front page. And there's very little editorialization, so we've also developed a metric of how much the newspaper article is changed across newspapers, and editorialization is the lowest on these sensitive topics. So the Diaoyu Islands topic, foreign policy topic, rule of law topic, and prison topic. So the question that we have is, if propaganda is a means of control, then what would have happened without the propaganda directive? Well, we can look at the title defectors from the directive to get at this, right? So what we find is that newspaper articles that change the title from the main title often tend to sensationalize the story. They don't tend to de-emphasize the story, they tend to sensationalize it. So for example, for the leak directive, remember we had 7 out of 22 of the papers actually changed the title. The Xinhua title, the official title, was the State Council approved suggestions on deepening the reform of the income distribution system. An example defector title was "Promote the formation of a transparent, fair, and rational income distribution." So it seems what was happening is the propaganda directive was trying to de-emphasize the fact that there's a lot of income inequality and that this is a problem and that they're trying to change it. They're trying to de-emphasize that within the newspaper. But the defector title, the newspaper itself, was trying to attract more readers. It's trying to sort of sensationalize this by saying we need to promote a rational income distribution, right? So for the corruption case, we also see this similar thing. The Xinhua title is that the Lai Changqing case was prosecuted. They're just saying that it was prosecuted. They're trying to sort of de-emphasize this corruption case. But the defector title actually includes that he was prosecuted on charges of smuggling and bribery. So they're actually trying to sort of more sensationalize the title rather than to de-emphasize the title. So perhaps propaganda is sort of preventing sensationalization of these news stories. So the first thing is on sensitive topics. The first sort of finding is on sensitive topics, propaganda seems to be used for control. So dissemination of information is used for censorship in this case. For papers, they mandate printing of one perspective or simply reporting. By enforcing dissemination, the directives can also specify placement, so they can de-emphasize the story by forcing it to be put on the back page. And it can also, by using propaganda directives, it can also dictate the title, etc., to de-emphasize or not sensationalize the story. So for readers, this means that these types of news articles are often buried in the middle of the paper. For people who do find these news articles, everyone will see exactly the same view, a very controlled, not sensationalized view. And so in this case, in these particular cases, the propaganda seems to also be used as a means of control. So what's on the front page? So what about the propaganda that we would think is like descriptions of meetings or general party ideology, propaganda that we typically think are we typically think of when we think of government propaganda? What happens to these propaganda topics? So typically these are like descriptions of meetings, general party ideology, and this example is simply a description of a big party meeting. And what we see is that front page propaganda is often occurring during sensitive time periods, during time periods where the party sort of thinks that they are most vulnerable. So for example, the percentage of propaganda on the front page, which is on the y-axis here, and date is on the x-axis, and we see that propaganda increases on the front page during these big sort of meeting 18th Party Congress, National People's Congress meetings. So propaganda seems like the party is dictating what newspapers should print on the front page during sensitive time periods, and not as much during not sensitive time periods. So the majority of propaganda in general is also occurring during these time periods. So there's just an increase in general propaganda during these big meetings. So what's happening here, what we think is happening is that the propaganda is being forced to the front of the page forced to the front page during sensitive time periods, and this is kicking off other types of stories that might be more controversial during the sensitive time periods. So what is missing from the front page that appears in other time periods? So we find that the topics that are most missing during sensitive time periods but are talked about on the front page of newspapers during non-sensitive time periods is information about economic planning, education policy, information about disasters, which is often de-emphasized during sensitive time periods, and information about poverty alleviation. So what seems to be happening is that these topics with substance that newspapers would typically print are crowded off the front page by propaganda during the sensitive time period. So in this case, propaganda might be another means of control for trying to de-emphasize those other types of news stories that might be more controversial. So this has a lot of different implications for the study of propaganda. It might be that the content of propaganda might be not as interesting as what it replaces, as the shadow of propaganda. So what would have been printed if not for the directive? Would those very sensitive news stories be on the front page and ultra sensationalized? Would, during sensitive time periods, more substantive policy information be coming to the front if not for propaganda directives? The idea is what lies in the shadow of propaganda. What would have happened had there not been propaganda? So we're arguing that propaganda might be used to block or distract. This is consistent what we've heard from propaganda online, that people who are paid to disseminate propaganda online are often trying to distract from negative news stories online by posting about other types of topics. In this case, because propaganda is not very noticeable, or we found that propaganda is not always noticeable or identifiable, people might not be able to resist it. Even sophisticated consumers of propaganda might not be able to resist it. And the other implication it has is that we may want to study how propaganda affects how newspapers are read. So if we have a newspaper that we know has a lot of propaganda that certain day, do people skip the propaganda and move to the back page? Do people find, are they sophisticated users of the newspaper, or does the propaganda directive really affect how they read the newspaper? So in conclusion, we gathered an enormous data set of Chinese newspapers. We've inferred propaganda directives by sort of looking at the big picture, by seeing which articles are printed on the same day by a whole bunch of newspapers. We've adapted new inference procedures to estimate topics on millions of documents in order to look at coordination. And we find that propaganda is not always obvious. It seems to also serve the function of censorship. And it implies a research agenda to study the shadow of propaganda, to study what would have been printed if not the propaganda. So I'm very interested in hearing your questions and suggestions. Yeah.
Well, great, Molly. Thank you. Really appreciate your presentation. At this point, Molly's available to take questions from the audience. You can call in to ask a question on the air at our toll-free call-in line, 1-855-667-8287. That's 1-855-NO-STATS. You can also email your questions to methods.colloquium@gmail.com. And finally, you can go to the GoToWebinar and ask a question on the Ask a Question box that appears in the webinar control panel, and I'll relay those questions on to Molly. For our viewers outside the United States, we recommend that you use the Ask the Question box to ensure that we receive your questions immediately. And some questions have come in, but I'm going to take my right as the moderator here and ask the first question, and then I'll get to some of the questions that others are asking. The question I have, Molly, is that you begin by noting there are two theories, that an indoctrination theory and a signaling theory, and you pose this as if you're going to test between them, and your central differentiation between those two deals with the persuasiveness of the message. And it's I think the key distinction between the theories, but I wasn't able to see how you can tackle persuasiveness within this framework. It seems that Huang's experiment probably gets you at it a little better, because you can then see what's affecting individuals or not. So do you have any thoughts of where you might want to push on persuasiveness?
Yeah, so I think so basically we're using a really different method. Instead of looking at the effect of propaganda on people, we're looking at the placement of propaganda as an implication of, observable implication of both of those theories. So for example, in the indoctrination theory, in all of these experiments with how propaganda affects individuals, the researcher has had to define what the propaganda is in order to study how it affects the individuals. And typically this propaganda is like ideological propaganda, or is some type of party ideology. But if it's true that propaganda is not all party ideology, but in fact a lot of control over sensitive topics, then maybe those experiments aren't as relevant to to Chinese newspapers. So that's one of sort of the implications, is that perhaps there's like a bigger purview of propaganda than either of these two theories expected. It doesn't mean that people don't respond to political ideology in that way, but it means that perhaps propaganda is much broader than we previously anticipated.
Okay, thanks. Ryan Moore had a quick question of whether some of the axes that you have on your graphs, whether the 0.2 actually means 20%. I suspect that's what you mean in the distributions.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Second, from Jenhook Zhang, like to hear a little more about your experience on the text processing and data mining as well as the data gathering. What were the major hurdles that you saw? How'd you get around those hurdles? And also, as a second point, is there any geographical variance in the types of propaganda that you observed? You know, is it highly localized? Do you see more in urban cities rather than rural areas, given your sample of newspapers?
Yeah, so this is I think this is quite an interesting question. So I'll do the first question first. So there were a lot of hurdles in collecting this data. There is just the hurdle of actually gathering it all, cleaning it. Each newspaper has a slightly different method of portraying their information, and so we want to make sure that we get the correct metadata and the correct slots in our database. There are many hurdles of actually processing Chinese text in particular because there aren't spaces in between words. So we have to use the statistical methods to segment the words in Chinese. We also we also have to, there are many, many more unique words in Chinese than there are in, say, English, and so we have to determine which words that we're going to use within the topic modeling framework. And we do that mostly based on stop word gathering or based on the amount we see a word within the entire corpus. If it's very, very rare, we typically will take it out. So those are the main challenges of pre-processing the text. For the second question, this is something that we've been looking into a lot. And I have two answers. So first, one of the things that I expected was that the provincial newspapers would be more likely to follow the directives than the local papers, the city level papers, because they're maybe they're closer to the central government than the cities. I don't find that to be true. They actually seem to coordinate with the same frequency as the city papers do. However, one of the things that I did find to be true is that city papers in general will talk more about negative topics than provincial papers. Provincial papers will often ignore any type of negative news, but that's outside of the propaganda directives. That's more on like city topics will talk more about pollution, they'll talk more about corruption, they'll talk more about all of these other things that aren't actually coordinated. So they seem to be more affected by commercialization than the provincial newspapers.
Oh, great. I don't have any questions coming in yet, but if anyone wants to send some in, please do. I am fascinated by the fact that you can get at mandates to publish, but it seems to me the same technique can be used to try and do an estimate of censorship, in which you might be able to choose topical articles that you might think would get broader play, and yet they're rare events, so they may sporadically occur in part of your subsample of newspapers. Do you give any thought to doing the reverse of? You've tackled the easy thing first. I think that's that's the great one to get at. How much are people following along? But it strikes me that you do have this interesting problem of getting at censorship too.
Yeah, so that is quite interesting. I think so. This is one of the censorship in this case is very difficult to observe because you don't know whether a story is getting very little play because it's simply not interesting to people, or actually a very small story, versus if it's getting very little play because it's directed not to get a lot of play. So there are a couple of things that you could do to try to estimate that. The first is you could look at types of events that you think were sort of big events, and then see what their distribution, how much reporting there were on these events within the newspapers. So for example, we did this on protest events. We found, this is a separate study that we were trying to do. We found a whole bunch of different protest events in localities, and then we tried to see how much play those protest events got. It's really very little. So every once in a while a city will mention it, or they will mention like very general guidelines for public security during that protest event, but they're typically quite small. The other way that you could think about doing it is if you have a newspaper that is not under the purview of the censorship directives, and you could compare the topical distribution within that newspaper and the newspaper within China. So, for example, maybe you could look at a Taiwanese newspaper or a newspaper in Hong Kong and try to see what the differences were. But it's harder. It's much harder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we do have a caller, so I'm going to see if I can make this thing work and talk to Andrew MacDonald directly. Here we go.
Hi, Molly. How's it going?
Hi, Andrew. How are you?
I just had a question for you about party control of newspapers. So, a lot of newspapers are party controlled, or whether directly or indirectly. And to what extent, or how does it work with your argument, the fact that this party control probably heavily influences the stories they cover and shapes their coverage, but doesn't, directly dictate the exact wording of the story and placement of the story? So, I think that kind of coverage would kind of fit into some of the arguments you introduced in the beginning of your presentation, but doesn't seem to be captured by the kind of testing you're doing here.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So if the party controls the newspaper or has more control over the newspaper versus a more commercialized newspaper, you might find that there's sort of more sort of subtle propaganda that isn't quite directed from the central government. I think that's what you're talking about, that more like guided by the ideology of the party in the newspaper. And that's certainly something we're not getting at with the directives. Mostly we're just looking at the actual the mandated printing of information rather than the perspective of the newspaper. We did try to collect newspapers that had similar amounts of party control because we didn't want we sort of wanted a homogeneous sample in that sense. We didn't want to find, for example, that we didn't want to find
Well, we seem to have some technical difficulties at this point. I don't know if the line's been dropped at Molly's end. However, we'll try and get her back. In the meantime, if she's listening and can hear, we do have a question in concerning how the emergence of the internet changed the practice of propaganda in China. We'll wait a minute or two and see what's happening. Molly, you there? Molly, you there? I think we're having some technical difficulty. Can you hear?
Oh, now I can hear you.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Sorry. So let's see. So the question that a question has come in is how do you think the emergence of the internet has changed the practice of propaganda in China, and is that a potential gold mine at some point down the road?
I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
Okay, let me speak up. So the question is, how does the emergence of the internet change the practice of propaganda in China?
Mm-hmm.
So is that going to produce a new gold mine of data that can be had, or are the techniques going to be quite different?
Yeah, so I think that this is a very interesting question. That I think the same problem applies to online propaganda as to newspaper propaganda. Is it's very hard to determine what is propaganda online and what is not. So we know that there are people online who are writing things in support or at the direction of the government, but we can't really tell who those people are without having some inside information. And so it makes it very difficult to identify a post. What is it propaganda? Is it not propaganda? However, this is not just it's not just in China that this happens. So, for example, we have sort of Twitter armies in many different countries that write information at the directive of governments in democracies as well as in autocracies. And so I think this is a larger question about how propaganda, how Twitter posters who are working at the directive of the government are influencing public opinion. I think that's a large research question that some people have started to tackle.
Okay. Leah Windsor would like to know, and so would I, where did the leaked directives come from? How many do you have for the corpus? How did you get your hands on them? What can you tell us?
Yeah, so there aren't very many. Well, there are a lot of censorship leak directives. There aren't very many propaganda leak directives, and these are mostly coming from the China Digital Times, which is a website that does it follows a lot of media in China. It follows a lot of what's going on online in China, and also what's going on within the propaganda department in China.
Okay, thanks. Ching Xing Wang has a couple of questions. One is a statement that the news on the front page may not be due to propaganda itself, but merely because of the importance of the news to the locality. And he wants to know if you tried to take any of that into account. I mean, you've got the context built into your LDA component, but can you get some kind of estimate of the importance of the news to the locality? And secondly, how did you choose these 25 papers? Are they based on regional variation, geographical distribution, dispersion, and what plans do you have for adding to the corpus, as if it wasn't big enough already?
Yeah, yeah. So for the first question, I think what the question is saying is perhaps some of the reason why the propaganda directives are on the back page is because there's local news that's more important that's been put to the front page. I think that's a really interesting question. I would expect that the reason why the propaganda is on the back page is because it's mandated to be there, mostly because most of the stories that are on the back page are ironically some of the biggest stories in China. So a lot of these big foreign policy stories that get a lot of interest, especially online with Chinese people. But I think it's a really good idea to look at what is on the front page in these different localities and to try to understand if perhaps there are some big things going on in a locality at a certain time that might mean that propaganda gets more pushed to the back. The second question about the distribution of newspapers, we collected, there are certain technical requirements for the newspaper in order to actually collect the data. So we tried to collect each of the provincial rubaos, and those we collected most of them. I think we got about 75% of them. And then from within each of the provinces, we have we picked like one city, one big city, and we collected that ribao also. We are hoping to expand it. The method expands really nicely to almost all local newspapers in China. And we're hoping to expand it to that, but it's a big undertaking, so it takes a lot of effort and databasing and infrastructure requirements. Yeah.
Jane Sumner has a question that's kind of related and then takes off in a little bit of a different direction as well, but she wants to know whether you said that the province-level papers don't seem to be systematically different from the city-level papers, but you find that city-level papers tend to follow their respective province-level papers. So if a province fails to conform, to the papers that are published by the lower levels within that province tend to follow suit. And she finally asked, do you also find that any particular provinces are less likely to conform than others, and if so, why? Or what's your best guess?
Yeah, so this is the first question is very interesting. I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't thought that of a city maybe a city is more likely to follow if the province does. I can test for that though, and I definitely will. The second is we really wanting to look into this. The next sort of step in this project is to look at both defectors in terms of following the directive, but also in terms of the title and the way in which the variation in which the article itself is written. So the amount of editorialization. And this is something that in the past there have been a few papers in Chinese politics that have indicated that newspapers often are following their political affiliation, their local political affiliation, and perhaps that this has to do with factionalism in China, and that would be an interesting finding if that were true. So we might try to test for that. Yeah.
Great. So one final question from Blake Miller, and he wonders what data points are you collecting when you're collecting the data on these papers, and I think probably the question you have time to answer would be, what do you find are the most informative features that you've used for your learning algorithms?
Yeah, so we collect a lot of different information, but it varies by newspaper. We collect the title, we collect what page it appeared on in the print version of the newspaper. We collect any keywords that were associated with it. We collect, of course, the text, the author, if it's available, etc. And right now in the STM, we've only been using time and newspaper to train the model. We could use other types of data, but we have a fair amount of missingness on some of the other components. Page number is the other one that we probably have the most data on, but it's hard to standardize across papers. We can always tell what's on the first page versus the other pages, but sometimes you have newspapers that have sections that are A and B and C, or A1 or B1, and we're not really sure exactly what order they appear within the newspaper. We always know that A1 is at the front, but we don't know exactly the rest of the order, so we're trying to work on that and actually pick up the physical copies of these newspapers. Excellent. Well, that's all the time we have for this week's International Methods Colloquium. I want to thank Molly Roberts of UCSD for what I found was a really fascinating presentation, and it's got a lot of rich data there that you can play with down the road. Next week, the IMC is going to be off for spring break. Tune in on March 13th at noon Eastern, 11 Central, for a presentation by Mark Neiman of the University of Alabama. You can go to the website, www.methodscolloquium.com, for more details. And we'll see everybody in 2 weeks. Justin will be back. And again, thank you very much, Molly. Really appreciate it. Thank you, guys. It was very helpful. Thank you.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye.